I'll just give a quick welcome just while people are joining. Welcome back
No
to
bother, yeah.
the series BIM Bites, where we'll be looking at stage 1 and 2 design measurement. Just a couple of reminders: we're recording the session today, and we'll have this available for you on Moodle within a couple of days for you to refer back to if you'd like to. And just a reminder as well that the next in the series is actually on Thursday. So that's Thursday at 11 o'clock. It was originally going to be Friday, so you should have got an updated invite. So just make sure you've got that in your calendar. If you don't, just pop us a message in the chat. Any questions as we go, pop those in the chat as well, please.
Yeah.
We'll take them at the end. With that, then I'll just say thanks again, Ross, and pass over to you.
No bother. Yeah, thanks, James. Welcome, everyone. Another session, BIM Bite number 6. Today, we're going to look at, it's basically the start of our process after we prepare the BIM execution plan and have really set up the framework for the project. It's kind of, okay, wonderful. What happens next situation? So we're kind of looking at stage 1 and stage 2 design, follow the rebuild plan of works. And just to note, I kind of jump between different project stages, structures, both international and REBA and so on. But the principle is the same here in terms of that early stage cost planning and the preparation of those early stage budgets for the client. How do we deal with, I guess, our own internal, as quantity surveyors, our internal standards? What are we putting in place, and how do we use those standards? And then what do we expect to get from the design team, from the models in these early stages? But let's just jump straight in. People are still joining, but that's okay. We can get into it. I'll skip past this again. Everybody should know who I am at this stage. A lot of the time, I'm going to repeat the same messages here throughout the BIM Bites. And the reoccurring message, of course, is collaboration, integration, communication. So historically, measurement, why QSs can be done in isolation. We often hear the guys sitting in the basement, the dark rooms, working away. Yes, we have our RFI sheets, etc., back to the design teams for clarifications and so on and so forth. But what we're now saying is that really needs to change, and we cannot carry out measurement in isolation anymore. We need to be able to speak to the design teams, especially about their understanding of the design, because it is their design. It's not ours. It's theirs. And while not everything is designed in the early stages, the principle and ideas will absolutely be there within the heads of the disciplines and the modelers and who have you, the specification writers. So chatting with them and meeting with them and talking with them will add huge value and quality to your cost plan, cost estimates, and rough order magnitude estimates as well. So what's not on paper, of course, could be in the heads of the discipline leads and your collaborators. So absolutely chat with them as much as possible if you can. We mentioned in the past sitting down for 10, 15 minutes each week with them, just to talk about what has happened the previous week, what's going to happen, risks, changes, etc. If we can set that up at the beginning of the project, it really puts us in a very good position in terms of building that collaboration between the different stakeholders. So understanding the design stages, what we're going to talk about here is the earlier stages, what level of information we expect to receive, how that differs from the different disciplines. Last week, we talked a little bit about how different disciplines develop and deliver their information differently. These earlier stages, of course, we do not have a whole pile of information. And we would know that anyway, historically, from these design processes. Those early stage estimates that's really where, as estimators and cost managers, our skill set lies, is really setting the budgets and the targets and managing change from those positions right through to the next gateway, etc. So we're just going to look at these early stages from strategic definition, preparation of the brief, and development of that early stage design, what could be called concept, schematic, whichever the terminology and phraseology that is used. You'll notice here in this particular graph that it changes slightly again. So understanding the level of information and the level of detail is key in terms of our communication with the design teams. We cannot, as you know, we cannot expect a detailed design level of information at these early stages. But what we can do is really try to understand what we will be getting from the design teams, and what we can use in terms of the digital information from the 3D model to help us in our process. But more importantly, it's how we're going to approach our project. And again, we'll define a lot of the standards in the BIM execution plan, whether it's ICMS or National Building Standards or the method of measurement we use or whatever the case may be. We'll define that. So we'll have already thought about this, but now we're in the position of actually having to set this up if it is not a standard that we're using internally ourselves in our own organization. And often while we're talking about BIM and project related kind of that micro element of project delivery, really we should also be looking internally in our organizations at the macro level, that overall organizational standards we want to implement on all our projects, because from our perspective as QSs, it's important to try and standardize our projects so that at least we're collecting this cost information, cost data internally. That's one value that we can take from it. But the other thing is about the team knowing what to do at each of these design gateways and stages, because that's how you do it as an organization. It's the same process over and over again. It's rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. That's where the efficiencies will come in terms of processing the data. So LOI and LOD, level of information, level of detail. We've already agreed this in the BIM execution plan. So we'll know what we're talking about, but it's important again to refresh, because obviously the design gateways are a period of time, and you might remember preparing the BIM execution plan 3 or 4 months ago, but now you're after bringing in new team members into the team. They might not know it. They might read it and still not understand it. So having these refreshers at the stages to understand the level of detail and level of information is quite important, I would say. And all of this information is available online. You can Google it, you can get as much as you want out of it. But for us here in Ireland, I think these parameters and understandings are going to be set now coming on the 1st of January next year. What do we expect at these different stages in terms of level of information? But an LOD 100 is obviously vastly different to an LOD 300 or 350. And I'll tell you now, I've never worked on a project with an LOD 400 or an LOD 500. While they exist in the BIM world, they don't exist in practicality. And if anybody on the call has worked with projects like that, or even has worked on projects where they have a requirement to fulfill that, I'd love to hear what your experience was, because the reality is that the industry is just not there yet for that level of information. And what do I mean by that? Clients aren't ready to manage buildings with an LOD 500. Their own internal processes haven't been set up. So even if it is mandated in the project and contracted within the project and the BIM execution plan and the contractor's requirements, it actually has no value often, because the clients themselves aren't set up. So if the OPW come at you with an LOD 500 requirement, really the question back to them is, well, have they the capability in-house to deal with that level of information? The reality is, no, they're not, because you need a real digital asset management platform to manage that level of detail. So let's come back up. So an LOD 100, that pre-design kind of very early stage budget setting onto schematic. And again, the terminologies change here as the phases. The reason we've done that rather than standardizing is that for anybody that's working in the international market, outside of probably Ireland and the UK, you'll see that these terminologies change and back and forth depending on local requirements and what standards they've taken. So we try to also highlight that within the presentation material here as well. But we will know within the BIM execution plan what level of information or what level of detail will be expected at each stage. And if we reflect back to the earlier presentations, we'll also define in the matrix where we would like information developed by the design team at the different stages. So this should be quite clear, but I would reiterate, refreshment at each of the stages for your team is great, especially when the team is new to these processes. But just a little bit of a kind of an understanding of what's the difference between the level of detail 100 versus 300. Really, it's got to do with the design information in terms of geometry and the detail associated with that geometry. So as you can see, that LOD 100 is generally a kind of a 2D. Often, I would argue that we don't do LOD 100 anymore. The projects we work on with our design teams that we work with, they would start straight into an LOD 200. They would model from inception. That's just because the maturity of the market. And I would say at the moment, we're still doing 2D AutoCAD, early stage sketches, etc. that LOD 100. And then we transition into the 200, either prior to planning, hopefully, or a lot of companies right now, they wait till after planning is approved before they'll, quote unquote, invest in modeling. But as the market matures, you will notice that the design teams will realize that there's efficiencies in jumping straight into 3D modeling because they'll have their libraries and because they'll have the capability in-house. So we won't start at 2D anymore. We'll jump straight into 3D and the volumetric design and so on. LOD 200, as you can see, it's just a shape. Hasn't been defined what exactly that is. It could be defined as a concrete slab. Whether it's in situ or horrorcore, we don't know yet. That's a conversation we would need to take with the design team. That's why those conversations are important. Even at the early stage of the design, you might not have the structural information. Really, you're sitting down with the architect or engineer trying to define what you expect it to be in order to be able to quantify, et cetera, the price. And again, we moved through the level of detail into 300. Suddenly, you can see now it's hollow core slabs, and likewise into 350, the inclusion of reinforcement or joint information or etc. LOD 400 ? We'd sometimes see it on projects as the for construction model. But that being said, 350 is generally what we would deal with to date. And the 500, as I say, I haven't seen that on the project yet, but that will be the future. So it's good to at least, I would say, understand these. So in an LOD 200, what do you expect to get? More than likely, when you extract information from the model on an LOD 200, you have the area, the OPEs, etc. probably are not in the design yet because they haven't been designed in. You probably don't know what it is, as I mentioned, only that it's a concrete slab. Hollow core or in situ remains to be seen, but that is up for you to estimate with the design team. That's part of your communication at these early stages. And then some people might say, but Ross, we don't quantify in these early stages. We'll get to that a little bit later. I would say that's quality of cost planning and estimating, I would say. So looking at the LODs, it's also important to understand that in these early stages, not every discipline is designing to an LOD 200. What do I mean by that? As we know in the early stages, your services isn't really there. It's diagrammatic, it's specification, it's almost like functional requirements rather than actual design within a model or AutoCAD, purely because obviously the architecture hasn't been locked down and the structure isn't there yet. So you will have different disciplines supplying information at different LODs and LOIs along the project lifecycle. It's not uniformed for each of the design stages. So if I just go back slightly here to the LOD 300 or even 200 stage, when you come to services in the very early stages, stage 2, you'll get main distribution for ventilation, probably water supply, hot and cold, and main electrical cable trays and buzz bars, depending on the project, of course. But you're not going to get any other information. That's all in the diagrams. That's still kind of functional. So we need to be clear about that and understand that. And again, asking the design team, what they expect to design at these stages. We'll define it in that matrix that we originally included as an appendix to the BIM execution plan. It has been discussed before, but again, refresher at the beginning of the stage to make sure everybody is on the same page when it comes to this level of information and level of detail. Often what it is architecture comes first, followed by the structure, followed by the services afterwards. That's kind of that level of design development that we would often see, and that can be off-putting a little bit and sometimes quite difficult, especially if the project you're working on is a MEP-driven project, if you like data centers, manufacturing, etc. But that's just the process in terms of design output. And again, we mentioned the last day, and we're repeating this. At this stage, we'll begin to understand how many unfederated models we're dealing with. At the BIM execution plan stage, while it can be defined, it can often change purely because of the level of competency or resources or how the project is actually approached by the design leads. But at this kind of stage, we will know the different unfederated models. And as we mentioned, it can be 5 up depending on the type of project. And again, in these early stages, what we're trying to do is take as much information as possible from the models, because we're starting that project life cycle of cost estimating and bill of quantity production quite early. Yeah, but I would say always accuracy here is achieved through communication. So those weekly meetings become important to you at that early stage with your discipline leads, in order to make sure that we're clear about what do we expect to receive, the level of detail, the level of information, is it in accordance with the BIM execution plan. They're the conversations that we're having. But from a cost perspective, we talked a little bit about kind of mostly quantities and design information, but from a cost perspective now, what's our approach on our project? Are we using ICMS as our cost breakdown structure with a method of measurement that sits underneath that? Are we using the national building standards? What's really our approach? That I guess would be defined again at that macro level, intercompany. These are the standards we're using within our organization. And from that, we can begin to define how we begin to build on this cost plans, cost estimates, bill of quantities as the design develops as well. So we now need to look at our approach as an evolution rather than a single point delivery at the end of each design gateway. So along the project lifecycle, we begin to evolve and develop this cost plan, cost estimates into bill of quantities, etc. So standardization becomes very important to us here. And the reason standardization is so important is because you want your team to be kind of focusing on where real value is created, and not kind of trying to learn what structure are we using within this project, what's our method of measurement within this project. We try to standardize. And sometimes, of course, the project dictates what we need to use. So if you use ICMS as your cost breakdown structure and reporting structure, perhaps a client comes and they have a bespoke structure they want to use. Our approach to that is we always use ICMS. That's our structure. And then we'll map whatever cost estimate, cost plan to whatever the client's needs are, whether that is their own internal or it's national building standards. It doesn't really matter, but our structure always stays the same. That way you get consistency and you get experience and knowledge the team do using that structure. They become very efficient then, and they know what to ask and what to expect at the different design stages. So standardization of the cost structure across all the design stages is important. We don't swap and change depending on whether it's a rough order magnitude, or it's a cost plan, or it's a bill of quantities we're producing. That same standard is right through, so we can follow the evolution of the cost plan, of the costs, depending on the levels. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So, as we mentioned before, ICMS is becoming now, I guess it mandated, if you like, from the 1st of January. ICMS will be the reporting structure that you should use. The SCSI, along with their partners, have mapped ICMS to the national standards, and it'll be mapped to ARM as well, ARM 4/5 when it comes out. Suddenly we have two different kind of reporting or cost structure standards, this ICMS and the National Building Standards. I would say that one needs to go. I'd say ICMS in the future will become the standard for cost breakdown structure and cost reporting. And underneath that, and we'll give you examples in a minute, the method of measurement, the national method of measurement will come into play for public projects, and well, for private sector, it really depends on client and or consultant what they prefer to use. So ICMS, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's available. We stuck links up a couple of weeks back. We'll do the same now later. ICMS is just a structured system. This is our own kind of template within Excel at the moment. And it's based on these hierarchy, main headings, subheadings, subheadings, etc., defining out the works as best they could, I guess, from within the ICMS board and group a number of years ago. It's interesting, the ICMS structures, it's some very positive elements, and then there's some areas where we would have challenges with. One thing is reporting within ICMS to the public sector here in Ireland. Another thing is, what does the client really want to see when it comes to their budgets and costings? And I think there's a bit of a clash there between the two systems. One is understanding what your construction costs are, for example, your budget for your contractor under a traditional procurement model. That's not very clear in under the ICMS structure. So little challenges here, but that depends on how you manage that internally yourself, and really what we've noticed is how experienced the client is looking at different numbers and different structures. So if we just go back you'll see here that we've highlighted substructure below 2.02, and then the subheadings below that 10, 20, and 30. And we just open up here in the next level here. And when we talk about ICMS and we talk about cost structures, we always talk about levels, because it's over time it becomes easy to understand levels. If we close the levels, if we close 4 and we just look at 3, we look at those main headings. If we close 3 and we just look at 2, we're just looking at those kind of 9, 13 components within ICMS. So levels is something within the terminology we'll use quite often. So ICMS has defined this for us, and now if we just have a look at the ICMS template itself, you can see it on the right. Same terminology, same coding structure, but you look at it and go, well, hang on a sec, Ross, you guys have a 2 in front of the 02020. Yes, we do. The reason for that is the very first initial level isn't defined. It doesn't have a numbering within ICMS, and we found that a challenge when we go into Costex and other systems when we're importing this information. We need that initial numbering system here to carry it for us under construction costs, because ICMS is not just construction costs, it's acquisition costs, it's operational costs, it's a whole ream of things like renovation and maintenance, etc., and it doesn't define a number at those main headings. So we decided that we needed to define that, and we wrote back to ICMS on this, and let's see what happens in the future. But so these numbering systems, and I think one of you guys the last day asked about, I think Jim, about the architects understanding ICMS numbering structure and then putting this numbering structure into their models. As we mentioned, I don't think that will happen. It's, even if we map it, it'll become too much of a risk on our side, and we'll need the freedom on our side to map and manage that information as it comes through. But in the future, absolutely, this could be a possibility, I would say. But we'll get back if you have any more questions on that later. So ICMS, and we're still talking about the early stage design here, and the reason for that is this is where you're going to be discussing this internally with your team and why you've gone and produce it in this way. And it's quite a good internal system, I would say. And then you look at ICMS to the method of measurement. So ICMS itself is not a method of measurement, it's just a structure. It just goes as far as level 4. It doesn't tell you anything other than the levels. And then you need to either choose, obviously, your method of measurements. Here we have NRM2 and ARM4. well, supplement 1, but ARM4, and that will then define what sits under each component within ICMS. So the method of measurements can change, which is one of the reasons I would say that we will struggle with the architects coding the models. And for us, we would probably only ever get a coding level at this upper floors and beams, for example, on 203, 030, 020, but nothing underneath it. We'll never be able to standardize what comes underneath that, because the method of measurements change, and because from public sector to private sector, our level of granularity and our association with the method of measurements change as well. So it'll become super difficult. And what you'll notice when we are designing as architects and engineers is that you have an infinite number of possibilities that sit underneath this in terms of geometries and sizes. So it becomes super difficult to actually standardize that. Potentially in the future, as we begin to maybe standardize components more, we'll get at least certain elements we'll be able to. But I would say right now it's a little bit of a struggle for us in that definition. But method of measurements, NRM1, NRM2, ARM4 is your method of measurements that sit underneath it. So within your process in the initial stages, we now know that we'll be getting a lot of kind of main components, architectural extraction from models. They'll be available. We might not know the type of walls that we're taking from the model, for example, but we'll know it's a stud partition. It's our requirement into under these method of measurements to have those conversations with the design teams to see exactly what we are pricing. And then the level of detail changes throughout the project lifecycle. So while you are in stage 1, stage 2, and that wall is undefined, or it's defined as a stud partition, maybe you don't have exact fire, maybe you don't have exact board numbers, but that will develop in the next stage, meaning that your overall allowance for linear meter of stud partition might be under one line item in the earlier stages, will now kind of develop into probably 3 priceable items because the design team have defined those elements more and more. So what you're doing is moving from one stage to the next, because you're using that standard structure and you're trying to develop out the design. You're also checking your previous work. You're checking your previous accuracy. Was that 150 linear meters of stud partition correct, or have we developed something new that's now 250 meters, for example? That's a major challenge if we haven't caught it in the change management process and our weekly meetings with the disciplines and discipline leads. So it's continually qualifying information as we build on what we've done previously. And a number of years ago, as we were communicating with design teams, they were asking us, but what would you guys expect to produce? And along the top, the design stages change here, and down along the left, the standards change. But again, it's the same principle in terms of those early stages. How do we develop a rough order magnitude, or how do we develop that early stage cost plan? What do we expect to take from the design material in these stages? A lot of the time in the very early stage, it might be square meter price benchmarking. You know, you're building a 150 bedroom hotel in Dublin, you will take your benchmarking from previous projects, etc. But as soon as, what we believe at least anyway, as soon as you begin to develop design information, we start quantifying. Because we're using that information from 3D models, it means that we're already starting the process. It's a little different if you're doing from 2D and you need to re-quantify every time on 2D, huge laborious task. Whereas if you're developing within the BIM execution plan parameters, you're able to begin to map these elements from the models, qualify models, etc. So a number of years ago, we need to define this for the design team so that they get an understanding, and clients also, in terms of how we believe the accuracy to be. Yes, we are quantifying and we're using unit prices at this stage for almost everything, especially at schematic. And in the mechanical, electrical, or the services, it's a mix of square meter price or quantity and unit prices, so that they get an understanding of, well, the quality levels that come with these estimates. Not such a major challenge, I would say, for the Irish and UK market, where quantity surveying is an ingrained discipline. But for the international market, some of the cost plans and estimates created in these stages are terrible, and don't have that level of quality in terms of quantification and accuracy. So for us to define that for them was important. So as we're saying here, that level of communication and development, it's not in isolation. It's with the design team. It's making sure that they understand your approach and you understand theirs. By the time you get into the latter stages of the design, which we talk in the next 2 BIM bites, your rapport with each other will be built up. The relationship will be there, and when the level of detail suddenly piles on, you're able to deal with that information quite efficiently as 2 groups, as the design team as well as as you as QSs. So this is the purpose for this kind of early stage investigation, setting the standards, making sure that we're building the relationship with the disciplines in order for us to get to a process at the end of detailed design where it becomes efficient. But today, in terms of the stage 1, stage 2, it is quite a short introduction. What you'll notice is we don't go into detail in terms of quantum outtake from the model. That differs from project to project, I would say. We talk about process, first of all, and then trying to implement that process on your projects with the different design consultants, because they all approach the design slightly different. So if you guys have any questions relating to the early stage, a lot of the stuff we talked about before, we're just setting ourselves up, as I mentioned, from the BIM execution plan, early stage development, ICMS as our costing structure, embedding a rule of measurement underneath that, as Aidan talked about last week, the challenges that also has. But really, it is about setting ourselves up for the latter part of the project delivery, where the level of detail is much more, and the delivery of our documentation obviously now becomes contractual if it's bill of quantities that we're producing. But this is the first step, I would say, or second step in that stairs. Yeah. Very good. Anybody got any questions? Anything in the chat there, James, relating to this?
Yes,
stage 1, stage 2.
Just asking, can you show maybe by a link a model BOQ page using ICMS measured using NRM2 or ARM4?
Yep. What I'll do then is I'll stick that in the presentation for next week when we dig into the architecture. I think it is actually on Thursday. I think it's the architecture, if I'm right. We put examples of what the early stage cost plans look like, maybe what a BOQ at these early stages using rule of measurement look like. Often in the early stages, we'd use maybe even NRM1 as our method, purely because of the level of design. But again, underneath that ICMS structure, your overall cost plan and budget structure shouldn't change. Yeah.
Anyone else likes to come in there? If you want to unmute.
Jim.
Ross, good afternoon. Thank you again for that presentation. Just taking you back to the level of detail, if I may, and maybe just explain where the various definitions are coming from, the LOD 100, 200, etc.
Yeah.
I suppose my question is really predicated on that all the design disciplines, if we are at LOD 100, for example, that the architect, structural and building service engineers, consultants are all producing design that's going to comply with LOD 100, for example, that are all on the same page, to use that expression.
Yeah, no, I can understand where you're coming from. That's theory versus practice. It's not reality, because what you'll notice in an architectural structural delivery is that in those early stages, they can get to an LOD 300 much quicker than the services can, because simply the services just is not designed in those early stages. Like, the engineers will not approach a ventilation system at that very early stage. If we go back to our stage gateways, in that very early design brief. But in the design brief, you might have architectural layouts, you might have those initial architecture. So the architect in the design and brief in that stage 1 might have an LOD 200 model for you, but no other discipline will have an LOD 200 model. The structures won't be there, the services won't be there. And so when you move to stage 2, structure becomes layered in, and suddenly you get what you're getting for architecture is like a 200, 300 for the structure. You're beginning to get your 200 for the mechanical, electrical. You're beginning to get main distribution at a kind of 200 level just on placement and location. So
Yeah,
I think that we need to be clear here that we cannot expect that level of detail from all disciplines at each stage, because unfortunately each discipline their delivery is almost staged. But by the time you get to, you know, that technical design stage 4, everybody should be caught up with each other in terms of that LOD 350, for example.
Okay. Yeah, I get that, and thank you for that clarification.
No
But
bother.
just briefly again, can you just direct us to the source document that sets out the LOD 100 and LOD 200? You know,
Yeah.
where is that set down?
Yeah, it's the BIM execution plan usually is where it's set. That's where we would be identifying these levels. But the BIM execution plan templates that are available won't have the matrices that you need to show that I expect foundations to be at LOD 200 at this stage. I expect electrical to be LOD 200 at this stage. That's something you'll need to set out yourself on your projects. I can pull in the example again next week of that matrix, just to show you how we've tried to define it on the project. And I must say, Jim, this is just trial and error. It's again the theoretical being applied to the practical, and the practical not working because the theory hasn't really been hashed out yet. You know.
Okay, thanks, Ross.
No bother. Thanks for the question. And sometimes these are the challenges that we're seeing on the projects. Is the BIM consultant that comes in really is coming from the theoretical background of how BIM should be managed, but the reality is that who's really using the information? Like who's using the information prepared by others? That's us as QSs. And it's not until we get involved in the conversation that we realize that, hang on, that this theoretical process actually isn't practical. We can't make that happen, because we can't expect the design teams to pull forward their design output when kind of the traditional path is architectural followed by structured followed by the MEP services. And we're all heading towards that final gateway of traditional procurement, obviously, that technical design for procurement. Yeah. And
yeah, I would just reiterate what you mentioned previously there on a number of occasions, Ross. The key to this, what I'm picking up, is collaboration.
Yeah, it doesn't work otherwise. Like,
yeah.
Another interesting one, it would be like cables in electrical. When do we expect the cables to be designed? In some instances, they'll never model cables because of the amount of work that's involved in modeling the cable. You'll find the cable on the diagram, no problem at all, for main distribution, and maybe the engineers will design the bus bars for really high voltage cable, etc. But that secondary stuff, none of that's really quantified, none of that's really modeled, because it's really down to the contractor to do. So we need to figure that out, as well as within our own industry here, of what are the design teams actually going to model, or where is their value to model certain elements that maybe traditionally they don't model. One for us in Denmark the whole time is reinforcement. It's never modeled. It's basically just designed within the diagrams and never modeled, but there's a big value with that within the structure, sub and superstructure, especially in situ, to model reinforcement from a risk perspective. But I think we've still something to figure out here within this process over the next few years, for sure. Yes.
No other questions there for the moment, Ross, I think.
No bother. Short and sweet today. So guys, yeah, Thursday it's James, you can confirm this, but Thursday we'll look at architecture and structure, I think. Or is it architecture, then structure is a separate one the following Monday, and then the last one is MEP, the services. And I think the biggest value creation for us is the MEP services, as our buildings are getting just probably more and more technical. So it'll become a big part of this, and there's a lot of value to be had in extracting quantities on the services, for sure.
Great. Well, thank you all again, and look forward to seeing you on the next of our series of BIM Bites on Thursday at 11 a.m. So if you don't have the link to that, just drop us a line at education@scsi.ie. You should all have it by now, but just in case. So I'll just say once again, thank you very much, Ross. Another great session. Thanks very much.
No bother. Thanks, everyone. Take it easy.
Thanks all. Bye now.